Welcome, folks, as we continue in our verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of Mark. We are at week number 23, and if you have your Bible, and I hope you do, hope you're following along with us, we're at Mark chapter 10, and we're starting at verse 32. Now let's remind ourselves of the context of what we're about to study today. Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, gives three passion predictions. Now remember, passion meaning prediction of his suffering and his death. And in today's passage, he's giving his third and final passion prediction, and he's following the same pattern, or Mark's following the same pattern in his presentation, where Jesus gives the prediction, then the disciples respond poorly, and then Jesus uses their poor response as a jumping off point to teach on true discipleship. And today, proof that the disciples still don't get it when it comes to the true role of the Messiah will be found in James and John's question following his passion prediction. It'll show that they're still stuck in the first century mindset when it comes to a political Messiah. So let's pick it up, Mark chapter 10, starting at verse 32. Let's read it together. It says, "They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. And again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him." Now, there's a lot packed in that single verse, so let's unpack it piece by piece. First of all, as your outline says, this is the first time that Mark explicitly lays out Jerusalem as Jesus' destination. This is the first time that it's clearly laid out by Mark, though it's been implied that Jerusalem is Jesus' destination. And 1A on your outline, they're heading south, yet they're heading up, because Mark is describing altitude, remember. So it says they're heading up, but they're heading south. Well, doesn't heading up mean they're heading north? They're not thinking directionally, they're thinking altitude. It's a climb up to Jerusalem from where Perea, where they were, down by the Dead Sea area. It's quite a steep climb, actually, quite an altitude climb. And that's what they're doing. They're heading up to Jerusalem. They're climbing up the mountain. And it says Jesus is climbing up the mountain, meaning it's a high incline, which you will discover when you come with us in March 2020 when we head to Jerusalem. I am excited about the many people who say they're coming. There are applications to join with us on our Israel trip. I hope you pick one up in the lobby and join with us as you'll actually experience the geography that we're reading about in the Gospels. Okay, let's keep going. It says, with Jesus leading the way. Listen to how Luke describes this journey in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. It says, "As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem." So as your outline says, Jesus' intensity has become visibly heightened. His intensity has become visibly heightened. The disciples noticed there's a difference in Jesus. It says that they were astonished, and that word means literally amazed to the point of being terrified. And afraid, meaning fearful. Now, that's a little bit odd though, isn't it? I mean, why did Jesus' followers have this kind of response? Why were they astonished? Why were they afraid? Remember the journey through Mark's gospel so far. Remember, we learned that Act 1 is the whole journey of who is this man? And the whole question of his authority, the deeds that he's doing, who is this man? And we learned that Act 1 was all about an unpacking of the displays of Jesus' authority through his word and deed. And then the key hinge from Act 1 to Act 2 was when Peter made a declaration, really on behalf of the other disciples, about Jesus being the Messiah. And Jesus finally acknowledged the fact that he was the Messiah, which led us, that was Act 1, which led us to Act 2. And the theme of Act 2 was, well, so who is the Messiah? And Jesus has already twice informed them that the Messiah must suffer, die, and rise from the dead. So who is this man? He's the Messiah. But who's the Messiah? Jesus says the Messiah is not who you're thinking. The Messiah is not entirely who you're thinking. He's not necessarily what you're thinking. He's not a political Messiah. He's not someone who's going to come and restore political Israel and kick out those Romans from Palestine. No, that's not who the Messiah is. So far, Jesus has unpacked twice already that the Messiah has to come. He's going to suffer. He's going to die, but then he's going to rise from the dead. And so far, this revelation has been falling on deaf ears. They are too locked into their cultural concept of a politically triumphant Messiah to grasp the concept of a suffering and, at some level, seemingly defeated Messiah. After all, the Messiah dies? Is he defeated somehow? That doesn't make sense to them. So Jesus, the Messiah, is now heading to Jerusalem, and in their minds, that can only mean one thing. As your outline says, the now acknowledged Messiah is heading to Jerusalem for a showdown with the religious and Gentile rulers, and everyone knew they were heading for a clash. Everybody knew and anticipated they were heading for a clash. And so they're astonished, they're afraid, the anxiety level is building. Think of it as a hockey game or a soccer match perhaps, and the two teams are standing across from each other during the national anthem, or side by side if it's a soccer game during national anthems, and they know, the crowd knows these two teams are heading for a clash. You're listening to the anthems, your adrenaline is rising, you're anticipating what's about to happen. That's how the disciples were feeling. Now, they were thinking probably it was going to be some type of political clash. Jesus, the Messiah, is now heading to Jerusalem, the capital city, to take over. Who knows what they were thinking precisely, but they knew something was about to happen. They could feel the tension rising. And number 2 on your outline, Jesus is determined to ensure that his followers are fully equipped to interpret the events they're about to witness. Jesus makes sure that they're equipped to interpret the events they're about to witness, even if they're only going to grasp this after the fact. Even if it's a matter of after the death and resurrection, they'll be saying, oh yes, remember when Jesus said this? Remember when he said that? Okay, now it all makes sense. So he was equipping them to be able to interpret what they're about to witness, even if it's just a matter of after the fact. And number 3 on your outline, Jesus gives the most detailed of his 3 passion predictions. So this is the 3rd time Jesus has predicted his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. And this 3rd and final prediction is the most detailed of those 3 passion predictions. Let's read it in verses 33 and verse 34 of Mark chapter 10. So Jesus, they're heading to Jerusalem, and Jesus says, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man," remember, that's a title he chose to describe himself, taken from the book of Daniel. "The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Now, as your outline says, 3a, only this version details the 2-step nature to the trial process. So only this version details what I'm calling the 2-step version of the trial process. As we've laid out those steps on your outline, the first step is he's going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be delivered to the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities will condemn him to death. That's step 1. And now he's added the 2nd step. This is the most detailed version. And then the Jewish authorities will deliver him over to the Gentile authorities. That's the Sanhedrin passing him on to Pilate. And together they will mock him, spit upon him, flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. So that's the most elaborate, the most detail that Jesus has had when it comes to his passion predictions. Now, remember the cycles that Mark has presented. Jesus predicts the suffering, the disciples respond poorly. Remember Peter's rebuke, and then they argued about who was the greatest. And then thirdly, in the cycles, Jesus turns this poor response into a teaching opportunity about the true nature of discipleship. Well, the pattern is about to be repeated here for the 3rd time. Jesus has again predicted his coming suffering. The disciples are again about to respond poorly. And we see their response here in James and John's request, verses 35 to 41. Let's just read verse 35 first. It says, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.'" It's quite the question. And as it says in your outline, these two brothers, along with Peter, were already part of Jesus' inner circle. Peter, James, and John. I mean, those names flow off of our lips, don't they? They were the three inner circle members of Jesus' team. So they were already part of the inner circle. So it's surprising that they would vie for some further special status. It really shows the strength and the determination of their personal ambition. Number 2 on your outline, Jesus' nickname for them was Sons of Thunder. That's the nickname he'd given them earlier in the Gospel. And it implies, as your outline says, that they had volatile or aggressive personalities. So it implies that they had volatile or aggressive personalities. They're the sons of thunder. They're guys who get things done. They're movers and shakers. They don't suffer fools. James and John were just two people who got things done. They just rattled people's cages. They were volatile and aggressive. And we see this coming out in the request they're about to make here. As it says on your outline, they understood that Jesus is nearing D-Day. And by D-Day, that's like a World War II reference. He's nearing D-Day as he heads to Jerusalem. So they are maneuvering themselves into high positions in his new messianic government. So see what's happening here. They realize he's heading to Jerusalem. There's going to be a clash. He's about to pull the trigger on his takeover of Israel. So the D-Day, the main conflict is about to happen. So they're maneuvering themselves into high positions in his new messianic cabinet, in his new messianic government. Think about the people surrounding a politician who's leading a party, and this politician is leading in the polls a week or so before the big election. So these people, what they do is they all maneuver for cabinet positions as their bosses. They're convinced their boss is about to be elected, and so they maneuver themselves to be in position where they'll be appointed into high positions in the government. That's, it appears, what's going on with James and John here. Let's pick it up in verse 36. Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. Look at their response in verse 37. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." Now, as your outline says, sit at your right hand and the other at your left. In this culture, proximity means power. Proximity meaning location or closeness. Proximity means power. It talks about in your glory. You can see Matthew chapter 20 and verse 21 for further insight on this. Their mother was in on this. So their mother is traveling with them here, and she's one of the other larger group of disciples from which the 12 were pulled or were called or were chosen. And so their mother's in on this. She's pushing her kids forward. She's your classic stage mom, you know. She's pushing her kids to the front to be stars. And as your outline says, they were not thinking heavenly glory. When they talk about in your glory, they're not thinking heavenly glory so much. As your outline says, they were thinking earthly, messianic kingdom glory like they had just witnessed. Keep in mind, they had just seen the transfiguration where Jesus and his glory is displayed on this mountain. And that's what they're thinking. Okay, you're going to have glory. You're going to have power like Elijah and Moses. And you're heading to Jerusalem now and you're going to reveal your kingdom. This is fantastic. Can we sit at your right hand? Can we sit at your left hand in your throne in Jerusalem? That's what they're wanting. Can we be really important? Can we be your vice presidents? That's kind of what they're saying in our context. Well, number 4 on your outline, Jesus' response is the Aramaic equivalent to be careful what you wish for. Jesus' response is the Aramaic, ancient Hebrew, if you can think in those terms, equivalent to be careful what you wish for. Where Jesus says in verse 38, you don't know what you are asking, Jesus said. That's the Aramaic version of be careful what you wish for, folks. And then he says this, and here's where we're going to pause for a few moments. He says, can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? And what's he saying here? Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? Take a few moments around your table, and you're going to see on your outline there, I have listed a bunch of verses when it comes to the cup and to baptism. I would like you, in groups or as an individual, whichever you prefer, to look up those verses regarding cup and baptism and see if you can understand what the word cup and baptism symbolize. Jesus is using a poetic metaphor here. What does he mean by cup? Can you drink the cup? What cup are you talking about? Can you be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? What does he mean? Like water baptism? What does cup and baptism symbolize? What do those terms mean? Look up those verses as a table or as an individual and see if you can come up with the visual, the word picture that Jesus was trying to elicit by using those two terms. Look those up, discuss them around your table, and we'll come back and fill in the blanks, answering the question about cup and baptism. All right, folks. Hopefully you spent a good bit of time looking up those passages and discussing them around your table. Here's what scholars have come up with as they've looked over the same verses that you were just looking over. As your outline says, cup was a frequent Old Testament metaphor for suffering and death. It was a frequent Old Testament metaphor or poetic device for suffering and for death. Baptism, often used in ancient writings as a metaphor for being overwhelmed. It was often used as a metaphor for being overwhelmed, like a flood. Being baptized with something was just like a flood, being completely overwhelmed. That's what baptism symbolizes, even, isn't it? For a follower of Jesus, you're overwhelmed with the water, you die, and you're raised out of the water again. It's to be overwhelmed, to die, and to rise again. So cup symbolized suffering and death, and the baptism symbolized just being overwhelmed. Well, with that in mind, let's reread verse 38. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you suffer and die like I'm about to suffer and die? Can you be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? Can you experience the overwhelming circumstances that I'm about to experience? Now, so that's what he asked them. He says, you don't know what you're asking for. Be careful what you ask for. If you want to sit at my right hand, are you going to be able to walk through the waters of suffering and overwhelming circumstances that I'm about to walk through? And they say, they hear, as your outline says, they hear Jesus' words as a challenge to greater commitment. That's what they're hearing. When they hear him say that, they hear him challenging them to a greater commitment. In other words, like kids respond to parents who challenge them when the kids want a puppy. You know, every parent has heard this. The kids say, can we have a puppy? And the parents say, are you going to clean up after that puppy? Are you going to feed them? Are you going to walk them every day? And the kids hear that as a challenge to greater commitment. Yes, we will. We promise we'll do this. That's what James and John are hearing Jesus say. You know, yes, we're willing to rise to that higher level of commitment if you give us those vice president roles. That's what they're hearing. But that's not exactly what Jesus is saying necessarily. Let's pick it up in verse 39. We can, they answer. Jesus, as your outline says, Jesus affirms the reality and the cost of their commitment. So they say we can. And Jesus, as we're about to see, he affirms the reality and the cost of their commitment. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink. So you will suffer like I suffer, and you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. So you will experience the overwhelming circumstances that I'm about to experience. She says that is true. You don't realize it, but it is true. But to sit at my right or left hand is not for me to grant, he says. So, in fact, historically, James will be martyred under Herod Antipas, and John is exiled to Patmos. So there is a suffering that each of them will experience. Number 7 on your outline, though, Jesus then stipulates that only the Father will decide upon this matter. Jesus stipulates, he says, only the Father is going to decide on the matter you've asked about. Jesus is even more specific in Matthew's version. In Matthew 20, verse 23, it says, Matthew records it this way. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right hand or left, my right or left, is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. So Matthew elaborates on that. Mark is more concise in his response. Matthew elaborates a bit more. And number 8 on your outline, the other apostles are furious. They are angry. They are furious. Likely because James and John thought of this first. That's probably why they're upset. Verse 41 says, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. So they are angry. How dare you ask this stuff? When what they're really thinking is, oh man, I'm upset you thought about this before I thought about this. Well, again now, following the pattern, letter C on your outline, Jesus teaches on servant leadership. Okay, so he's had his passion, suffering prediction. There's been a poor response by some disciples. Jesus, yeah, we heard that, your prediction. Okay, when we go down into Jerusalem, when we go up to Jerusalem, I should say, can you make us your vice presidents? So just not the response that Jesus was looking for. So again, Jesus uses this poor response as an opportunity to teach and clarify the role of the Messiah and true leadership. As your outline says, C1, Jesus contrasts the world's way with the way of God's kingdom. Here, Jesus contrasts the world's way with the way of God's kingdom. Let's read verses 42 to 45. It says, Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Well, that's the world's way. So he's appealing to their common experience. He says, you know that, meaning it's your common experience. We all have the experience. Here's how the world does things, that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. They impose their authority over them. They stick their noses up around them. They make it be known that I'm the boss and you're not. That's what Jesus is saying. That's how the Gentiles, that's how the world operates when it comes to leadership. And their high officials exercise their authority over them. And then verses 43 to 44, he says, but here's the way of God's kingdom. He says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Now, notice something. It's not wrong to want to be great in God's kingdom. Ever think about that? Jesus doesn't say, those who want to be great, shame on you. How dare you? He doesn't say that. He says, if you want to be great, here's how you do it. Let me show you the pathway to greatness in my kingdom. Those who want to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. So there's the world's way, and then there's the way of God's kingdom. And then as we see in verse 45, the way of God's kingdom is modeled by the Son of Man. Again, the title from Daniel that Jesus takes upon himself. Now remember, the Son of Man in the Old Testament is someone who's a high authority, a figure of great splendor, a figure of who all authority and power has been given, a figure who is worshipped. And the question is, well, let's read verse 45 first. It says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, who would expect the one in Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14, where the Son of Man is described, who would expect the one in Daniel, the one given authority, sovereign power, glory, the one who's worshiped by all nations and peoples, according to Daniel, the one who receives an eternal reign and an eternal kingdom that will never be destroyed, who would think that that person, the Son of Man, would come as a lowly servant, let alone give their life as a ransom for many? But that's what Jesus is saying. And as your outline says, for the first time, Jesus explains why the Messiah must die. This is the first time that Jesus explains why the Messiah must die. And the reason is ransom. He's given his life as a ransom for many. And as your outline says, ransom, the word here means the price of release. Ransom is the price of release. The Messiah, his death and his resurrection, and he just touches on it here. The Apostle Paul unpacks this much more in the epistles in the New Testament. But the Messiah gives his life as a ransom for many. He is the price of release. He's how we get our liberty from sin and from shame. And so Jesus there is giving us detail at a level that he's not given us previously when it comes to his passion, his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. And then we go into what's something that seems like something that's not connected, but it actually is. This is following up, and this is sort of the last step before we head into Jerusalem and before we turn to Act 3, the third and final act of Mark's Gospel. And this is where Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus. As your outline says, D1, this is the last healing episode in Mark's Gospel. It's the last healing episode in the Gospel of Mark. And it's the final event prior to Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem. What it does, as your outline says, 1a, it sets the scene geographically, theologically, and symbolically. So it sets the scene geographically, theologically, meaning theology, and symbolically. So it sets the scene geographically, theologically, and symbolically. How does it do that? Well, geographically, Jericho is near Jerusalem. Jericho would be on the way between where they were down in Perea and on the climb up to Jerusalem. In fact, Jericho is 17 miles, well, Jerusalem is, Jericho is 17 miles northeast of Jerusalem, but it's 3,500 feet below Jerusalem. So think about that. In those 17 miles, which isn't all that far, they're going to climb 3,500 feet. And so Jericho is north of Jerusalem, but lower than Jerusalem. So it sets the scene geographically. Theologically, Jesus is portrayed as the son of David in what we're about to read here, the Messiah who is heading to Jerusalem to fulfill his messianic task. And it fulfills it sets the scene symbolically because those who were blind received sight by trusting in Jesus. So it's all geographically, theologically, and symbolically. This healing sets the scene for what's about to happen in Act 3. Let's read verses 46 and 47. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, so they're heading now from Jericho up to Jerusalem, with a large crowd were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, as your outline says, with no social welfare system, begging on a main thoroughfare, main street, was the best option. They didn't have a welfare system, so begging on a main street was your best option, apart from stealing. So this is clearly better than that. And number 3 on your outline, Son of David, was a popular term for the Messiah in the first century. This was a term that was growing in popularity, and it was a popular term in the first century. Although this is the first usage of the term in Mark, it will be repeated once he gets to Jerusalem. Let's keep reading, verse 48. It says, many rebuked him. That is, they rebuked Bartimaeus and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. So the man's Bartimaeus' social insignificance influenced their ability to tune him out. Okay? So this man, Bartimaeus, his social insignificance, he's a blind man. He's begging by the side of the road. That influenced their ability to tune him out. They probably walked by him every day. He's had his hand up. He was begging. He was accosting them maybe in some way. Since he was blind, he couldn't see who was walking by. He could just hear, so he'd have to shout out all the time. They were so used to just tuning this man out that, when he was calling out, Son of David, have mercy on me. Just be quiet, Bartimaeus. Stop it. You're always shouting out at us. They're so used to telling him to be quiet. They're so used to ignoring him. This was just something usual. But look what happens. As your outline says, Jesus calls upon the man and he enthusiastically responds. We see that in verse 50-52 where Jesus calls upon Bartimaeus and Bartimaeus enthusiastically responds. It says, throwing his cloak aside, not verse 48, verse 49, I should say, starting at verse 49. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet, that is Bartimaeus, and he came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. So as your outline says, Jesus initiates a dialogue to provoke faith. That's what he's doing here. When he says, what do you want? It's pretty obvious, I'm sure, what he wanted. But again, Jesus is initiating this dialogue to provoke faith, and the man's trust is rewarded. And what this does is, then, it brings us to the edge of Jerusalem. So this is very symbolic. The blind people calling out, trusting Jesus, and as the blind call out and trust in Jesus, he restores their sight as the Messiah. It's very symbolic about what Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. And that now brings us to the edge of Jerusalem. He's leaving Jericho, he's heading now into Jerusalem, and the next time we interact with Jesus, he will be triumphantly entering through the gates of Jerusalem, and he will now, for the first time, allow himself to be publicly hailed as the Messiah. And as you can imagine, this acceptance of this public acknowledgement that he's the Messiah just raises the tension level even that much more. He's gone from, who is this man, to he's the Messiah. Well, who's the Messiah? And he's been unpacking that. And now next time we get together, we're about to turn the page to Act 3, where Jesus now heads into the final week of his life, where he now publicly acknowledges he's the Messiah, which just stirs the hornet's nest of the religious and political elite in Jerusalem. And so we've concluded now Act 2, and it's going to bring us to Act 3, the final act in Mark's drama. Look forward to us picking that up next time we're together.